Hello and welcome to Satisfactory. I've been dropped onto an alien world in full 3D first-person view, which is a horror beyond comprehension to an automation game enjoyer, and given one objective: do exactly what my AI supervisor Ada tells me to do, and make my employer, Fix-It, proud.
Loading objective-based introduction. Begin onboarding.
In all seriousness, the first thing I need to do is place down this hub, which I presume is what's going to facilitate our progression in this game. If the game audio is muted at points, it's probably because Ada is speaking, and even though she is my boss, you're here to listen to me, not her. And also, she speaks a lot. Anyway, I've got two interactables here: a terminal, which will let me upgrade the hub, and a crafting bench to craft the materials to upgrade the hub. To craft things, I need ore, so I go over here to chip away at these deposits with my hand tool. Back at the crafting bench, we're clearly living in the future, because we've got one of those hammers that you can hit ore with really hard to turn it into perfect ingots. I kept clicking the crafting button there with my mouse, but quickly realised you can just tap the spacebar once and it goes on crafting forever. Anyway, iron ingots can be turned into iron rods, which we need for this first hub upgrade, which gives me access to my own box to put stuff in, as well as semi-automatic mining. I can build this equipment workshop by combining iron rods with iron plate, which is also just made straight from ingots, and in that I can craft a portable miner. Plonking that down on this handy iron patch over here sets it off, and it will automatically mine iron, which I can retrieve by hand for crafting purposes. A bit of iron rod and plate crafting later, I can complete my second hub upgrade, giving me a wall. I also get this biomass burner around the back, which takes in leaves and wood I can collect off the ground to generate electricity. It's not too useful yet though, because we have nothing to transport the electricity with. Using this handy resource scanner, I can locate the nearest copper ore deposit to rectify that, and once there, I place down some portable miners to start collecting it. You can place as many portable miners as you like on a deposit, the only limit being your sanity, as you're the one who's going to have to go move it. Whilst running back and collecting wood and leaves from the ground, I see this weird bird flower thing, and I was curious, okay? With my magic hammer, I can turn copper ore into copper ingot, into copper wire, which along with iron rods can be used to build a smelter, so we don't have to manually smelt our ore anymore. To power it, I need to further craft the wire into cable, and use that to connect the smelter to the biomass burner. Each building can only be connected to one cable, including the biomass burner, so for now, we can only have one smelter. With plates, rods and wire, we can upgrade the hub again, which did something to it. It also unlocked power poles, so we can actually connect more than one thing to power, but they do require concrete. That brings us to this limestone deposit on a nearby beach, where I place down some more portable miners. I hate having to hand move stuff, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying to place these things. Also, ignore the presents everywhere. It was near Christmas when I started this run, and I turned it off as soon as I figured out how, because we can't have any Christmas cheer getting in the way of building the factory. Once I've crafted some of that limestone into concrete, I can get a whole 2 furnaces connected up to my power grid. I've also unlocked my most complicated recipe yet. A whole 2 ingredients where I cut iron rods into screws and then use that to stick some iron plates together into a reinforced iron plate. That allows me to build constructors, which are used to automatically craft single recipe items. That's right, only single recipes. If you've never played Satisfactory, you'll understand better once I get into some logistics, but there is actually different crafting buildings depending on how many solid and fluid ingredients a recipe has. Walking out to the edge of the nearby lake whilst some iron plates craft for my next hub upgrade, I see some interesting stuff. Not the presents, but there is this quartz rock I mine a bit of, and most interestingly, a big blue glowing slug rising out of the middle of the lake. I'll put that in my pocket. Even more interestingly, I find a split in a nearby cliff full of spiders, and hear me when I say this quote-unquote weapon is not inspiring in battle, but after fighting through them, I found this cool iridescent coalesce Mobius strip hybrid thing known as a summer sloop. That wasted just about enough time for my next hub upgrade to craft. This is getting a bit repetitive now, but it is only the game's tutorial, so I've got a bit more patience than usual. The next upgrade is a lot of the same kind of stuff, so I get that done, which finally lets me automate some of these processes end to end. I can place this miner Mark 1 on the nearby iron patch, which is slow and needs power, but has a belt output, meaning I can run the mined ore out automatically into the smelter to make ingots, and the ingots straight out into a constructor to make iron rods. The last hub upgrade also gave us a second biomass burner, which is fortunate because I'm immediately going in with a second miner furnace pairing to make iron plate. I explore up these cliffs above my base a bit whilst the hub upgrade materials accumulate and find a Mercer sphere. That's the third and final type of mysterious alien artifact that this planet holds, and in time we'll find a use for them. I also put down a proper miner on my copper patch so I can automate copper wire, and with that unlock the final hub upgrade. Tutorial over. This is where the real game begins. Going back to the hub, I can now see 9 tiers along the top there, each of them containing a few milestones we can complete by bringing the required resources to the hub and launching them off in that cargo hauler that just landed a moment ago. This is essentially the equivalent of your technology tree in another automation game, but as you can see I only have tier 1 and 2 unlocked, so you might suspect that unlocking the rest has something to do with that objective in the top right to build a space elevator. That's going to take a lot of resources, so I place down these containers in front of my intermediate constructors to buffer more than just the 100 or so that accumulate in the machine's output. Along with the space elevator, completing the hub allowed me to craft biomass out of wood and leaves, which just straight up gives me more energy for almost free, which is good because I still have to go out and collect it manually to keep my grid online. I soon sent off my first cargo pod for the logistics milestone, which gives me access to conveyor mergers and splitters so I can merge and split my belts, as well as conveyor lifts to move items up and down easily. The next milestone I want is foundations, so I don't need to build straight on the bare, bumpy earth, but for that I need to automate concrete, and the instant I place down a mine on the limestone, I put my power grid in the red. In Satisfactory, this is a dramatic affair, as your buildings don't just slow down, but stop entirely, so you either need to improve power production or turn off some buildings until you're back in the green. Once you've done that, you can just toss this big switch to reactivate the grid. I compensated by placing down and connecting a freestanding biomass burner, which, although possessing a belt input, I'll still be hand feeding for now. So with concrete automated, I set off for some more exploring. Exploring is a major aspect of Satisfactory's gameplay loop, which, whilst I appreciate isn't everyone's cup of tea, served as a good break from intense production chain planning. The combat certainly leaves a lot to be desired though. Most encounters in this game are more frustrating than exciting, and I spend most of the time later in the game trying to cheese enemies rather than out-tech them. Enemies in this game don't ever really go out of their way to attack you. Rather, they usually defend some sort of artifact or point of interest, and enemy scaling, as well as some other environmental hazards, are used to stop the player from just going out and getting everything straight away. Sometimes the most interesting things are the least alien though, as I find this crashed cargo pod out here in the nearby desert. It would certainly seem to me that we aren't the first pioneer here on Massage. The site is swarming with these alien hog things, but I fight my way through them using these beryl nuts I've been picking from bushes to recover health when I need to. I also gathered some free materials from around the crash, and I'll open the main pod in a moment, but first I just saw a lizard doggo, so I want to go pet it. These damaged pods usually need either items or power to repair and open, and this one wanted rotors, which although I've never crafted before, I found some in the wreckage so I'm able to open it, which gives me a hard drive. I'll find a use for that very soon. Nearby, I found a different flavour of power slug, this time yellow. And then, on my way back, I find another crashed pod with quite possibly the most annoying bastards in existence. These little spawner things that spawn annoying wasps that get everywhere and do loads of damage. This crash site had copper sheets and steel beams around it, which I haven't even got researched yet, so that's pretty nice. Also, the cargo container didn't need any repairs, which is even nicer. Just as planned, I get back to base to find that I have enough resources to finish my next milestone, giving us the ability to build foundations. It turns out these milestones need a lot of concrete, so I make my first use of splitters and mergers to make a second concrete constructor. I'm stood here on a lookout tower, which is intended to help compensate for the lack of bird's eye view that other factory games have, before we unlock methods of flying later on. Anyway, my next milestone unlocks obstacle clearing, which unlocks solid biofuel which is crafted from biomass and gives us even more free energy, as well as a goddamn chainsaw. Now, rather than running around picking up leaves and sticks off the floor every 20 minutes, I can go chop down some trees and get a fuck ton of wood and leaves all at once to keep my base powered. I still don't like the idea of having to turn all of that into fuel and feed it into the generators myself though, so let's automate it, starting with laying some foundations. I then place down a container for leaves and a container for wood, feeding their outputs into these constructors which will automatically turn them into biomass. And combining the two biomass outputs onto one belt to pass into one more constructor that turns them into solid biofuel. Me being me, I got distracted in the middle of that and built a molecular analyzer machine, or MAM, which I put one of these hard drives into from earlier to let me choose an alternative recipe. This time I could choose from either being able to make copper wire from iron or turning ingots directly into screws. And I naturally choose a second option, because that's extremely convenient. I can also research things I find in the world in the MAM, such as artefacts or alien remains, which can unlock certain items and buildings for me. Anyway, back to my biofuel power plant, where I make this little belt arch over my walkway with some conveyor lifts, before feeding the biofuel belts into a little array of biomass burners. Once they're connected to the grid, it's official. I now have a tiny little 75% automated power plant, where all I have to do is feed it wood and leaves, and the rest is done for me. The nice thing about biomass burners compared to every single other power source in the game is that they only burn fuel on demand, so I don't have to worry about any of this being wasted. Over in the MAM, I can sacrifice one of my power slugs for the sake of science, which gives me the ability to hit them with my magic hammer until they turn into power shards. Blue slugs give us 1 shard, yellows give us 2, and purple slugs, when we find and research one, will be able to be turned into 5 power shards, and they can be placed in the machines to speed them up. Up to 3 shards can be placed into a machine, and each one gives us up to a 50% speed up. And I say up to because Satisfactory does this really nice thing where you can pick exactly what speed you want the machine to work at. So if you're the kind of person obsessed with ratios, you can fine tune your entire factory. There is a trade-off to power shards though, as they exponentially increase power consumption based on production speed. Anyway, I've placed down a humongous platform hovering over the nearby lake to house this, the space elevator. I'll just let you watch the animation as it connects. Try not to think about the fact that the tiny platform it's sat on would absolutely flip up and go flying off with the forces involved here. My objective has now been replaced with Complete Phase 1, which requires me to deliver 50 of this smart plating item into the space elevator. That's more like it. My second hard drive in the MAM yielded this recipe for rotors, which uses copper and screws, which is overall more efficient than a normal recipe that uses iron rods and screws, which is useful because they're one of the ingredients in smart plating. Since smart plating takes 2 ingredients, it's built in this new building called an assembler, which has 2 belt inputs and 1 output. Each of these can craft 1 smart plating a minute, and I decide that 2 per minute seems like a reasonable amount, so I go for a second one. Building in 3D like this can be frustrating, but there are some tools I discover later, like holding control to snap, which make it a bit easier. Unfortunately, I hadn't yet got the memo about not being too close when building, so rather than force you to suffer through me jamming my face against the machines, I have this nice little overview of the finished thing. I'll try a bit harder to make the building footage comprehensible going forward. Turning it on, however, will probably blow every fuse in this place, so I first add a second floor to my biomass burner setup to double my grid. The ability to expand vertically in the literal sense is pretty underutilised by many in this game, including me going forward. Alas, with the building done, I just need to connect the smart plating outputs together and run them over to the belt inputs on the space elevator. If I've done my calculations correctly, we should have the 50 required in about 25 minutes, so I've got some time to explore. Not even a minute later, I'm getting my ass whooped by this hog, and I have to run back into my factory to hide among my belts and hit it from where it can't hit me. Okay, how about I finish off some milestones instead, such as this one for the Resource Sync bonus program. It unlocks this shop, within which I can use tickets to buy mostly decorative items, with the tickets coming from putting items into this awesome sync. The more complex and expensive the item is, the more awesome points it generates, and each subsequent ticket costs more awesome points to print, so they get costlier and costlier as you print more. Anyway, I found a huge cave in the cliff face over my base, and running through it to the other side I emerged into a big canyon, where I found an even bigger piggy to get kicked to death by, and then a little spot where I could hit it to death with impunity. I also found a sulfur rock, which I should be able to research in the MAM to be able to search for an actual sulfur deposit, before finally, in the very back corner of the canyon, finding some quartz deposits, guarded by this lizard with a fire flower. It's pretty annoying only having 2 hand slots to swap between, because it means I have to do things like open my inventory to swap in my food mid-fight. Thankfully, I can increase my number of slots with research in the MAM. I'm heading home with a load of quartz in my pockets because the space elevator has finished filling, when I find that this canyon also has coal. I've played factory games before, so I know I'll be back for this stuff very, very soon. Anyway, at the space elevator, I just have to load up the items into the capsule, and then Ada has a little presentation for us, of which the important page is this one. Automated power is the one that's piqued my interest specifically, probably something to do with that coal we've just seen. Then, we can watch it all get launched off into space. These animations at the end of each phase are always a treat, some of the most stunning visuals in the game.
Phase 1 of Project Assembly completed. This is only the beginning of Project Assembly, the first step towards saving the day. You have performed adequately so far. Reminder, not only is Fix-It saving humanity, it is saving all of Earth, including kittens and puppies. It is statistically likely that you appreciate the continued existence of kittens and or puppies. Continue the work for their sake. Continue the work for Fix-It. It is time to start the work on Phase 2 of Project Assembly.
Looking into the hub, I indeed now have access to tiers 3 and 4, and with that a milestone for coal power, which, to be clear, is now priority numero uno, although steel production is also interesting. I don't quite have enough reinforced plate to finish the milestone though, so whilst that accumulates I go on a bit of a research streak through the MAM, researching the sulfur that I collected, all of the different types of alien remains I've collected, mycelium I got from fungi in the caves, and finally summer sloops and mercerspheres. Although it appears I'll need to find some of that purple ore called strange alien matter, or SAM from now on, before I can utilise them for their actual purpose. Anyway, rather than boost my reinforced iron plate production, or do anything else productive, I go hunting for slugs, spheres and sloops. It's not entirely unproductive since Phase 2 wants 1,000 smart plating, which is very slowly being ticked away at. but to make the other 2 items I need to complete some milestones which don't get progressed by me being way out here. One of the environmental hazards I was talking about earlier is toxic gas, which you're meant to get a gas mask to get past, but you could just get in and out really fast. Or if you're like me, you could just die. Fortunately, I'm faster the second time. On my travels, I find some Caterium, named after Fixit CEO Katerina Parks, which is a weird nugget of lore about quite how far-reaching Fixit was on Earth, given that this is literally gold. It's even named Goldar in the game files. So this company was so powerful they renamed an entire element after their own CEO. If I got into this game's entire lore, it'd need its own video, which it might get, but I'll stick to just the interesting tidbits in this video. You might have noticed that in the bar on the bottom left I now have Blade Runners, unlocked using quartz in the MAM, which are a type of footwear that lets me jump higher and slide further, aiding in my exploration of the planet. With the Caterium sample I gathered, I can now scan for deposits and find one very close to my hub. I end up belting it back to nearer my factory, where I've set up a smelter to make ingots in case I find a use for it soon. I can finally unlock coal power, so I head straight over to build a mine on that patch I found earlier. For transporting it back through the cave, I've decided to use stackable conveyor supports, since I figured that I'll end up needing more than one belt of coal, and might even want to bring in some quartz, so this lets me neatly stack the belts rather than running them individually. Once back at the hub, I run the belt down to the water, where I've prepared a big platform to place the power plants themselves. They're pretty huge machines, with a belt input for coal, but also a pipe input for water. We use these humongous extractor buildings to get water, and it's transported through these pipes made of copper sheet. Belts can be pretty annoying to place, but at least they're predictable, whereas these pipes are annoying to place and not immediately obvious how they work. Since we're in 3D, we need to wait for the lowest pipe to fill first before the ones above them do. But once the water level rises to my coal plant, we've finally got that beautiful clean coal power. The one plant only consumes 15 coal per minute, and since this lowest tier of belt I have transports 60 items a minute, I can run 4 coal plants off it. With each plant producing 75 megawatts of power, that brings us to a total of 300 megawatts, or 10 biomass burners. An important thing to understand about the power generation in this game is that with the exception of biomass burners, all power sources run at full pelt all the time. So even if we only needed like 40 megawatts, this plant will still use the full 300 megawatts worth of coal. But for reasons we'll see later, this can actually be beneficial. Now that we have sufficient power, I start the basic steel production milestone. But whilst I wait for rotors to accumulate for it, it's time for another exploring session. This time I've got a rebar gun, a very primitive ranged weapon that makes dealing with these annoying spawners a little bit easier. Upon picking up this random Mercer sphere on my travels, I get this message.
The effigy has no song, only echoes, but is part of a river. Why does the effigy avoid the windows?
Attention. Your brain's operations are outside typical parameters. Time spent daydreaming will be deducted from your sustenance budget.
This is an ongoing thing throughout the game, and to avoid having to show it every time it pops up, I'll summarise it for you now, so mild spoilers for the next 20 seconds. There is an alien intelligence on the planet who starts communicating to Ada through the Pioneer, and they hit it off. Also, some of the things they say suggest that this planet was once an ancient factory world of this alien's race, which explains some of the weird structures we see around the place, and the presence of the artefacts. It might also have something to do with this SAM deposit I've just found. Remember that? I set down a few portable miners, and then run home triumphantly with some in my pockets. I've run home triumphantly with some in my pockets, where I can research it in the MAM. I first researched the ability to scan for it, and then I unlock Reanimated SAM, which is just crafted from raw ore. Using that, I unlock SAM Fluctuators, the research for which requires steel pipe, but fortunately I found some around some crash sites. Dimensional Uploader catches my eye, but that needs SAM Fluctuators which need steel pipes to craft, and I have very little left, so I guess it's time to set up steel production. That coal patch I set up on earlier was a pure node, meaning it gives twice as much ore as the miner's baseline mining rate. There are also impure nodes, which give half baseline. Since this miner now produces 120 ore per minute, I can use a tier 2 belt, which is made from reinforced plate, to run the output into this splitter, and break it into 2 tier 1 belts. I would just run a single tier 2, but all that reinforced plate is far too expensive for me right now, and plus, it's not too annoying to run a second one since I had the foresight to use stacked conveyor poles. I've also used up all the iron ore nodes near my hub, but fortunately there's a trio of deposits a little ways out to the north. I'm only bringing the ore from one back right now, but I again use stacked conveyor supports so it'll be easy to bring the other two when I need them. Steel is made in foundries, which require these modular frames to build that are a combination of reinforced plate and iron rods. They look a bit like furnaces, but vitally have 2 inputs which allows us to smelt 2 items together. In this case, of course, iron ore and coal. I've gotten a little bit better at connecting up the inputs for these machines, but there's a long way to go, and I eventually figure out some tricks that make it a lot quicker and cleaner than this. Once the inputs and power are connected, we start producing steel ingots. Very nice. I hastily throw together a second floor, getting up there with these ladders I just unlocked from the awesome shop, and place 2 constructors up there, one for steel beam and one for steel pipe. The only 2 uses we have for steel right now. I then go and connect up the other 2 iron mines from that cluster, because although steel beam is ingredient 1 of 2 for versatile framework, the second item we need for phase 2, the second ingredient is modular frame, which is going to need a decent amount of iron. My initial plan was to make quite a large array of tileable reinforced plate setups, not just for modular frame but also to be used for tier 2 belts, but I'm about to unlock the much better and cheaper tier 3 belts, so I didn't end up completing more than like 2 of these. I do, however, place a dimensional uploader here for reinforced plate, which you'll soon see is quite powerful. Basically, it uploads any items we put into it into a pocket dimension that we can access from anywhere, letting us craft and build using reinforced plate without it needing to be in our inventory. It's not all powerful. Uploads are quite slow, and the pocket dimension can only hold a stack of each item, but we can alleviate both of these drawbacks with researching the MAM. Anyway, combining those reinforced plates with iron rods gets us modular frames, and combining that with steel beams gets us versatile framework. The assembler is set to a rate of 2 per minute, giving us about 8 hours until the objective of producing 1,000 finishes, but I'm already planning on boosting my steel production to reduce that time. Improving that production includes freeing up some of the coal that I'm belting over, so despite the fact that in the grand scheme of things I built that coal plant very recently, I'm going to go make a bigger one elsewhere. There's a big crater up near my sand mine with a few pure coal nodes next to it, which seems like the perfect place to build. Almost like it was designed that way. Also, a little pro tip I figured out in this moment: instead of trying to line up buildings perfectly using your mouse, you can just hold control and they snap edge to edge. Anyway, for this plant we're moving up in the world a bit, as I've actually decided to try and make it somewhat aesthetically pleasing. It's also twice as big as the last one, consuming 120 coal per minute thanks to a tier 2 belt I splurged some reinforced plate on. I even went and purchased some pipeline wall supports to make it extra special, but ran into the problem running the pipes up to the plant, since the water extractors aren't powerful enough to push the water all the way up. Each building that outputs a fluid has a stat called head lift, which is a measure of how many meters it can push a liquid vertically. And if you need more, you need to use a pump like this one to provide more head lift. Job well done, I'd say, although don't let this trick you into thinking I've gotten any better at building. Before I get too far ahead of myself expanding versatile framework production, I should probably set up the third ingredient of Phase 2, automated wire. It's again made in an assembler, this time by combining a stator with 20 cables. We only need 100 of these, so I'll set the target at like 1 per minute. Stators are made by combining steel pipe with copper wire, so this thing is like 90% copper, and it needs a lot of it. I scan my copper options and see that there's a single node to the north, or like 3 in a cluster way out to the west. So I build a sky bridge out to the latter to bring them home semi-neatly. Here's an idea of the full length of the bridge. Make no mistake, it's incredibly annoying to build and takes a while. I sure hope this doesn't end up being the most convenient way to move resources or anything like that. Anyway, I smelt that ore into a load of copper ingots, which I then craft into a load of copper wire, that gets split between making stators and a fuck ton of cables, which means we can finally start producing automated wire. Just as we can see the first automated wire crossing the belt to the space elevator, we've completed our smart plating quota, so I can cut off production. With all the ingredients for Phase 2 automated, you know by now that it's exploring time. I take off to the far northwest where I scaled the tallest point in the game and found a uranium patch. I'm sure that's going to become very useful later. I then find an actual sulphur deposit not too far from there, which I cover in far too many portable miners. Back home, I research how to make fabric from mycelium, which gives me access to the gas mask and the ability to craft the filters it needs to work, meaning I can now happily walk through those gas clouds spread around the world. A milestone gives me access to the Xeno Basher, an upgraded melee weapon, and I've managed to get up to a whopping 6 hand slots by research. You can see me here making the most of my new abilities in this nearby cave. On top of a nearby cliff, I find a bauxite patch, a funny name for what is basically aluminium ore, which I'll be very interested in later, but appear to have bitten off more than I can chew with the local wildlife. Fortunately, there's something else I unlocked using that sulphur I was mining earlier. Nobelisks. They aren't really intended to be weapons, not the basic ones anyway, but rather to break apart boulders, but they still do a lot of damage. After a few hours of exploring, I return, rich in power slugs, mercerspheres, and even with a few summer sloops in tow, to find my filled space elevator, where I can launch off Phase 2. This time, Ada's presentation informs us of oil production, trains, jetpacks, and more. But before we get to any of that, let's watch the animation as Phase 2 of the project constructs.
Phase 2 of project assembly completed. You have been performing more adequately under pressure and are closer than ever to saving the day. Perhaps you were the right choice for the job. Time will tell. You will now enter Phase 3 of project assembly. Continue as you are, and there should be no issue. For humanity, for fix it.
It never gets old. This phase has 3 components again, the first of which being 2,500 versatile framework, so we'll just leave those running. Before I even start looking at what I need to do to produce the other 2, I'm beelining straight for that jetpack. It needs motors, for which we combine stators and rotors, so it's time to get handcrafting. Once I unlock it, it's pretty good. Not exactly groundbreaking, but I didn't realise until way later in the game that the type of fuel you use matters. So of course using solid biofuel wasn't going to yield desirable results. I next spend some time making blueprints, done in this big machine, which I proceed to literally never use. I think the problem is that I decided to make a big block of 6 constructors, when in reality you either don't need that many, or need way more than that. So it's a better idea to make a tileable set of 1 or 2, with all the inputs already set up. Also, you can't retroactively decide to blueprint something. It has to be purpose-built in a blueprint machine, and usually by the time I realise I need a lot of something, I've already built most of it, and it's too late to bother blueprinting it. All of the oil processing buildings need motors, so I decide to automate them, starting with turning Caterium into quick wire, to using an alternative stator recipe where it replaces the copper wire for slightly better resource efficiency and speed. Since I didn't think I needed any more smart plating at this point, I tore down that setup and redirected the rotors here. I added quite a few ingredients to my dimensional uploader network at this point, including encased industrial beam from combining concrete and steel beam, which is used in many advanced buildings including tier 2 miners, oil extractors and refineries. Before I can get to anything oily, I'm going to need power, but thanks to the power of power shards, I've got the power to do that simply by doubling up my water extractors at my coal plant, running a second set of pipes up into the other side of the building, filling all the coal plants with 2 power shards each and overclocking them to 200%, and then upgrading the miner to Mark II, along with some tier 3 belts to move the coal into the plant fast enough. Anything you can do to mine faster is always worth it, as ore deposits are finite in number, but themselves never run out of resources. Anyway, way out on the west coast, I've struck black gold, so I've placed down an oil extractor and began to build out the necessary refineries to turn it into what we want. Refineries have 1 fluid input and output, and 1 solid input and output, and in this case the 2 recipes we're interested in turn straight crude oil into either plastic and liquid heavy oil residue, or solid rubber and liquid heavy oil residue. Both make 20 of the solid component per minute, so with a single power shard in each boosting that to 30, we can get 60 plastic and rubber per minute with these 4 refineries. Once we've routed out both products, I pass them through a smart splitter, which, if either ever backs up, sends the excess off to get melted into awesome points in an awesome sink, to make sure the heavy oil residue doesn't run dry. Why, you might ask? Well, over here, I'm using a refinery to turn the residue into fuel, which, when passed into one of these fuel generators, can be used to produce 250 megawatts of power each, for a total of 500 megawatts. Very nice. Even better, I based my numbers on the heavy oil residue output of 4 plastic plants, but it turns out producing rubber actually gives you twice as much, so I can support a 3rd fuel generator. If plastic or rubber back up, of course, I lose the residue production, and therefore power production, which is why I must sink any overflow. Your regularly scheduled programming has been interrupted to bring you this frightening footage of me painting half my base in the tackiest fucking gold colour ever known to man. I'm sorry. What's worse is the outrageously long sky bridge I built to get the rubber and plastic back to my hub area. I've come here to set up some really messy smokeless powder made by combining heavy oil residue and black powder, and used in this, the rifle. Those fucking spawner nest bastards don't stand a chance now. Yes, die, you bastards. Anyway, I spend a long time exploring that I should probably be spending building, because I now have the ability to make the next phase 3 ingredient. But whilst out, I do find this Mercer sphere overlooking my base that I've somehow missed for the last 20 odd hours. Further procrastinating, I built this radio tower using 3 ingredients I plundered from crash sites which we'll meet later, and some cables. It lets me see every resource node within its range, as well as telling me the quantity, but importantly not location, of all the artefacts. Modular engines are the next ingredient for phase 3, which needs motors, rubber and smart plating. So I automated modular frames. It is actually going to be useful very soon, so it wasn't a waste, just a strange choice. Anyway, I choose this area in the northwest for my modular engine factory, since it's got plenty of iron, a bit of copper and some coal, so we can make steel. Don't ask how I intend to get the rubber over here, we'll build that bridge when I get to it. I start off with a load of iron ore smelters before feeding them into foundries. But you already smelted, you idiot. Well, you see, I've recently unlocked an alternative recipe from a hard drive that gives us more steel for our iron and coal just by smelting the iron first, which is a no-brainer because smelting's probably the simplest thing in the entire game to do, and not particularly power hungry for what it is. You can see me here taking advantage of this cool new feature I found where you can stick a splitter directly onto the end of a conveyor lift, allowing for these neat double input manifold designs. I'm producing so many steel ingots here that I need to upgrade to using tier 4 belts on the output, which take encased beam and transport 480 items per minute. The next metal I need is copper, but rather than feeding the ore into smelters, I'm feeding it into foundries. This is because copper is much rarer than iron, so I'm using an alternative recipe which lets us make the ingots with a 50-50 split of iron and copper ore. I then set up stators, rotors, motors and smart plating, and what do you know, all that's left now is rubber. Ah yes, another sky bridge. But why two? This is why. I figured I'll never earnestly use these things when trains exist, but for the sake of completeness I'll use one to bridge the gap over to intercept my rubber belt so I can leech off it. To make them work, you need to set up some truck stations where items will be loaded and unloaded, and then record the route. Once you've recorded a route yourself, the truck can repeat it endlessly without you needing to drive it. I did unlock a smaller truck in the last phase, and it probably would have been more practical than this, but I thought I might as well go with a real deal, coming to a supermarket car park near you. All that's left to do then is bring all those ingredients together, and since there's 3 of them, we need this big new building, the manufacturer, with 4 solid inputs and 1 output. With some more salvaged computers, I researched production overclocking in the MAM, which allows me to put some summer sloops in my buildings and double their output for the cost of a lot of power. It doesn't double their input, just their output, meaning we get twice as much modular engines for the same amount of ingredients. The number of summer sloops required depends on how many inputs the machine has, so constructors need 1, assemblers 2, and manufacturers 4. To get the desired production volume, I would need 2 of these manufacturers, but rather than spend expensive and precious summer sloops, I instead opt to use 2 power shards to double the machine's speed. I run the modular engines over to the space elevator to be stockpiled, before looking at the power grid and realising that manufacturer is now consuming 550 megawatts of power due to the compounding effects of the shards and the sloops. That's about 30% of my entire grid, and is pushing us near the limit, so I'll need to deal with that. I set up an extractor on a second oil patch, and turn all of the oil straight into fuel, as well as a byproduct of polymer resin, which although being able to be turned into plastic or rubber, I'll probably just sink for convenience. I'm not merely content with just fuel though, so my next step is to craft some containers out of plastic and fill them with fuel using this packager. Along with a hard drive and some compacted coal, which is made from coal and sulphur, this can be used to research turbo fuel, which gives us a higher energy value for the same amount of fuel, provided we mix in some compacted coal with it. It turns out that's actually a pretty big pain in the arse, since sulphur isn't very common and there's no coal near my oil setup, so I get started on another big sky bridge, this time to the south where I've scanned a sulphur and coal node within a reasonable range of each other. Once I'm nearby, I set up the 2 assemblers which will actually craft the compressed coal, before finding the coal patch in a basin to the west and a sulphur deposit at the top of a nearby pillar. I get it down the cliff face by inelegant methods, and then run the resultant compressed coal along the coast back to my oil area. With the 60 compressed coal per minute we're shipping over here, I can make 75 turbo fuel per minute, which is good for 10 fuel generators or a further 2500 megawatts of power. Here's what that looks like. Pretty tasty. It's time now to get the 3rd and final ingredient for this phase done, which starts back at my modular frame factory with a fuck ton of screws. I'm then making encased beam and steel pipes at my modular engine factory and belting them along the side of my rubber highway. Told you I wouldn't use those things again. Once I'm back at the modular frame factory, I'm combining the frames with screws, steel pipes and encased beams to make heavy modular frames, which is itself only an ingredient of the item we actually need. Ingredient 2 we already have, it's the automated wire from the previous phase. And ingredient 3 and 4 are circuit boards and computers. Although since circuit boards are needed to make computers, we can basically just make computer production and it fulfills both. Computers, unsurprisingly, take a decent amount of copper, so that's what I'm starting with. Although I'm just using the normal recipe for the ingots, since I don't have any unused iron deposits nearby, but I do have a decent amount of copper. Next up, I'm belting in some plastic, because this game respects the idea of not printing conductors onto conductors, unlike basically every other factory game ever. If you ignore the teensy little fact that we seemingly make rubber-coated cables with just pure copper. Anyway, that plastic is being combined with copper sheets in an assembler to make our circuit boards, and combining those with more plastic and some cables gets us computers. I don't know what humans were doing for the last 300,000 years, this shit was easy. Anyway, I run the heavy modular frames across the bare sand like a barbarian, and then connect everything up to another manufacturer in an absolute mess of belts to create the final phase 3 component, adaptive control units. I have, of course, summer-slooped the final manufacturer, which you can see visually from the strange purple gases which escape its vents and fog its power connector. Very soon after, enough adaptive control units have crafted and we can finish this phase. Looking at Ada's presentation for this phase, we can see aluminium production, the hover pack, aerial transportation and nuclear power, all of which seem interesting, although I was disappointed when I found out those drones things aren't a vehicle I can fly, but just a point-to-point logistical technique. Anyway, those materials I sent up were for the project's dry dock, so let's watch that build before we get back to work. You can almost see a little ship thing in the middle there. That must be my way off this planet. My immediate first move is to make a 500 metre tall freestanding ladder to get back to that bauxite patch I found at the end of phase 2. It's a pure node, so with a Mark II miner and 2 power shards, I can extract 480 ore per minute from this one patch. That's a full tier 4 belt, which uses expensive encased beams, but once we've got aluminium set up, we'll have fast, relatively cheap belts forever. I'm using the huge power towers to get electricity to this thing, since it's easier than using a dozen of the little power poles. Encased beams are so expensive for me that I transport the ore to my base with tier 3 belts for now, and I'll go back and replace them with tier 5 once we've unlocked it. I've built a big platform on the opposite end of the lake from my hub, where I'll construct my aluminium processing, which begins with some refineries. In these, I combine bauxite with water to make alumina solution and silica. To provide enough water, I've started using tier 2 pipes, which can carry twice as much fluid for the small cost of just some extra plastic. To continue down this crafting chain, I need 2 resources, quartz and coal, neither of which are nearby, so it's time for the long awaited trains. They require these huge station buildings to load and unload, each one servicing a specific type of carriage, locomotive, solid cargo, or fluid cargo. So in this case I have 2 locomotive buildings at either end, and 2 solid cargo buildings in the middle. In hindsight, you definitely only need 1 station, even if you have 2 locomotives, since there is an empty station type 2, but I was still unsure of how it worked at this point. My destination is far out north, near that uranium patch that I found earlier, and rather than go for the classic sky bridge, I allow the occasional support pillar on this stretch. Once I've built the station at the other end, I build the train itself, but it doesn't work straight away since it's actually battery driven, and charged from the grid when in station, and I haven't connected the station to the grid. Meh, I didn't want to drive you anyway, so I go ahead and set up my nearby coal mine before plugging it straight into the input of the first station. There are 2 belt inputs, and with the maximum tier of belt carrying 1200 items per minute, that means that the absolute limit on throughput is 2400 items per minute per cargo wagon. Although that would require a train every 100 seconds, which needs a very short loop of a lot of trains. Quartz is out in the other direction, in a cave system so expansive that despite that, its entrance ends up right next to my coal mine. Once I find it, rather than run the belts back out the way I came in, I decide to just, don't worry about it. It ends up coming out pretty near my train station, so my mockery of nature was rewarded. Setting up a schedule is super easy, just requiring me to select 2 stations and giving me a few simple conditions, though I just chose when loaded/unloaded, or been waiting for 2 minutes, and selected what resources should be loaded and unloaded. Okay, so combining the coal and alumina solution in a refinery gets us aluminum scrap, and annoyingly, water, which we'll have to get rid of somehow. As mentioned earlier, fluids in this game have gravity, so I tried just feeding the byproduct water into the first refinery input from above, which will hopefully take priority over the new water that has to be pumped in, which mostly works, although I find a better way to do it in a later aluminum build. Of course, the much easier solution I somehow never considered would be to just boil it off in a coal power plant using some of that coal we're literally bringing in for this build. Anyway, if we combine alumina scrap and silica in a foundry, we finally get out aluminium ingots, which closes the loop of the first step in the process, since we can get rid of that silica in this process. The purpose of the quartz then is just to be turned into silica to top this up, since the first step doesn't make enough to feed the last. I'm using this fancy new priority merger I unlocked from the MAM to make sure the byproduct silica is used up before the new stuff. Although I've got the ratio locked down pretty tight thanks to overclocking, so even with a normal merger, it probably wouldn't have been a problem for a long time. That would have been really satisfying if I'd remembered to connect the foundries up to power, and if I'd connected the silica inputs. I'm just going to cut, this is embarrassing. Like every other resource, the ingots are pretty useless on their own, so I'm turning them directly into aluminium casing here, which just needs the ingots, and then by combining the ingots with copper ingot we can get alclad aluminium sheet, which is actually what's used for tier 5 belts. Now I have aluminium, I've got access to a few new exciting technologies, including the hover pack, which gives me Minecraft creative mode style flying when in range of my power grid, and hazmat suits, which combine these iodine-infused filters to make me immune to radiation, meaning I can access some hard drives and artifacts blocked by uranium rocks. I've had my first taste of trains now, and I'm addicted, which manifests in the form of this massive bi-directional train skybridge I'm starting to build. That enthusiasm immediately dies when I try to actually build an intersection with them. Despite the rail segments having no obvious start and end points, the game remembers how you placed them, and tries to snap the joints of the sections, which is incredibly annoying and means you can't just place them in long lines and fork them in the middle. You have to painstakingly set out every fork. And don't even get me started on the fucking signals. I realised quickly what I'd gotten myself into by committing to the rail network. Skipping past the pain and suffering of building rails, I built a big platform for some stations in the Northern Forest, which is actually one of the areas you can choose to start the game in. It's got a lot of iron, which I waste no time feeding into a train with 1 locomotive and 4 wagons, as well as a bit less copper which I still feed into a 4-wagon train for consistency. That's not all though. As I continued my network along to the northern coast, where I ran it through a big arch, I'm here for one thing: oil. So I set up this huge building which just turns 3 whole oil wells worth of oil into plastic. I wouldn't get too used to this level of architectural finesse. especially since I immediately put the heavy oil residue voiding power plant in the bare wide open right next door. All that's left to do then is connect it up to a train station and build the obligatory awesome sink to keep that power plant going even if we aren't using all of the plastic. Back home I can put down 3 train stations to drop off each of these 3 ingredients so I can get started on the assembly director system, the first phase 4 component. That starts with supercomputers, which need computers, AI limiters, high-speed connectors, and plastic. Both AI limiters and high-speed connectors need quick wire, so I bring in some Caterium from my nearby patch before starting on the other ingredients, which are almost entirely copper and plastic. AI limiters take quick wire and plastic, high-speed connectors take quick wire, cable and circuit boards, and you already know how computers are made, so supercomputers come together pretty easily. The more annoying part was setting adaptive control units back up, since I foolishly cannibalised my previous setup to provide myself with computers for construction. Although I at least still have the heavy modular frame production, which makes setting them back up hurt a little less. I can finally combine the adaptive control units and supercomputers to make the assembly director system, so I'm finally making some progress into phase 4. Before I start the next component, I have some mysterious and important work to undertake, starting with gathering this nitrogen from the very northwest coast. To do that, I use this well pressurizer to pump it up, and then these well extractors to actually pipe it out. Since it's a gas, head lift isn't a concern, and I can run it straight up a sheer cliff face with no pumps. I then get distracted and set up liquid biofuel, which is literally just made from solid biofuel, water and plastic canisters, but is a much better jetpack fuel than the solid stuff. Just look at how long it lasts. Anyway, I ran the nitrogen pipe all the way back here, where I put it into this new blender building which has 2 fluid and 2 solid inputs and outputs, to combine it with aluminum casing and heavy modular frames to make fused modular frames, which will be very important soon. I find a lizard doggo in my aluminium build and decide to name him after one of my Ko-Fi supporters. The random name generator gave me Nathan14321. This is the bastard who spent 3 months reacting to my every message in my Discord server with a horse emoji, and even awoke a disloyal sleeper agent mod to change my moderation chat to a fucking horse emoji. I'm gonna be back for you. Anyway, my mysterious and important work begins and ends with this, a nuclear power plant, which I'm planning to set up to give myself effectively unlimited power for the rest of the run. Crafting the fuel rods is going to be probably the most complex thing I've done in the game so far, and requires a ton of random resources such as steel, which I've started off by building a new factory for. I then need a limestone, as well as of course uranium, which I'm mining with a tier 3 miner I unlocked thanks to those fused modular frames. And then I need Caterium and sulfur, which I'm turning directly into sulfuric acid by combining it with water in a refinery. My fuel rod manufacturer itself I've fully slugged and slooped, giving us 2 uranium fuel rods per minute, which comes out to 25,000 megawatts of power. So, combining uranium, concrete and sulfuric acid gets us encased uranium cells and some sulfuric acid back, and encased beams are encased beams, but the last ingredient is a bit different. Electromagnetic control rods are made from stators and AI limiters, made in this absolute kludge, and requiring me to belt in some copper from a nearby patch. It's going to become more clear as we go through this nuclear build, because the uranium fuel rods aren't the end, that I don't have the mental bandwidth to make both a pretty and functional build for this. Once I connect up the uranium belt though, it all slowly starts to boot up and at least appears functional. As mentioned earlier, that number of fuel cells can provide 25,000 megawatts, or 10 nuclear power plants, but I'm going to fully power shard them, so I only need like 4. Unlike production buildings, there's absolutely no downside to sharding power generators, except for the fact that it costs you shards. Eventually I connect the first power plant up to water, and feed in some fuel cells, which kicks it off generating power. It also kicks it off generating uranium waste, which I'm going to have to find something to do with besides just store in a container, since it'll quickly fill that up. I soon get them all set up. Since each generator buffers up to 50 rods, it's going to take a while before the end ones kick in. On a side note, here's a cool video I found of what these nuclear power plants were gonna look like back when this game was in development. It's an absolutely absurd design, but I'm gonna be honest with you, I'll take character over realism any day of the week. Anyway, this isn't the end, because each one of those reactors now shits out 25 uranium waste per minute. And if I don't start doing something about it, I'm going to end up with a multi-mile radius radioactive death sphere. The first step in turning it into not a death sphere is combining the waste with silica, nitric acid and sulfuric acid to make non-fissile uranium. The only new thing there is nitric acid, which is made by combining nitrogen, water and iron plates in a blender. The next step in the process requires one of these particle accelerators, which takes a lot of expensive items I'm not producing yet, so I'm mostly either scrounged or bought from the awesome shop. Yes, that is something you can do, and it's an absolute waste of tickets which Ada bullies you for, but if the devs didn't want me to do it, they wouldn't have let me. Anyway, by combining non-fissile uranium and uranium waste, I can make plutonium pellets, which are the base of an entire new crafting chain of fuel rods. Here's the thing in action, easily one of the coolest buildings in the entire game. Immediately, combining these pellets with concrete gets us encased plutonium cells, ingredient 1 of the plutonium fuel cell. The next two ingredients, steel beams and electromagnetic rods, already had everything needed nearby, but the final ingredient is heat sinks, which need alclad sheet to craft. Rather than belt or train it all the way over here, I instead decided to use these new drone depots I just unlocked. The process is as simple as placing a depot back at my aluminium production, setting a path between the two, and giving it to this drone, which will fly back and forth delivering. They're pretty picky about what fuel they can use, but fortunately, plutonium fuel cells are one of the acceptable ones. So I just hand-fed a bit of aluminium to get it kicked off, and then I'll fuel the depot from the fuel rod manufacturer. I tried to ride the drone back to my nuclear setup, but got kicked off halfway, although it did save me a bit of time. With the fuel rod manufacturer fully slooped, I can run an entire 4 more nuclear power plants off the plutonium fuel rods. Although they do still produce their own waste. We must be back at square one then, you probably think. Fortunately not, since plutonium fuel produces much less waste, and where a uranium-fueled plant might fill a container with waste in 10 hours, a plutonium-fueled one would fill it in 100, and we have a lot of containers. With the power sorted out, and 50 gigawatts of power at my fingertips, I can just move on to the second phase 4 component, the magnetic field container, which is almost anticlimactic, as it's just made by combining versatile framework and electronic control rods. Before we get on to the other two components, I have a little present to give to a friend. Slightly cruel, since he just brought me some SAM, but this'll teach the bastard for his war crimes in my Discord server. I decided that I wanted a bit of a change of scenery for setting up the final two Phase 4 components, so I built a massive railway all the way down south to the grassy fields, which is actually the first option for where you can start, and therefore where most people start their first runs. It also has these waterfalls coming over from the sea, which are just crimes against geography. If you listen closely to the falling water, you can hear the song of 1,000,000 rocklickers crying out in pain. Don't even get me started on the architects and physicists looking at my sky bridge there. I think this is the place where I'm going to build my biggest factory yet. The first thing I need to make is more heavy modular frames, and I liked this idea of this building with the manufacturers at the end and a sort of mezzanine where the actual production buildings will be, but quickly realised that's not nearly enough floor space. I'm even putting it in a building with walls, windows, doors, and a roof. The whole 9 yards. But I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse here, since I've barely even begun the interior. It ends up being pretty cramped on the inside, and I had to give up the mezzanine, but on the outside I'm pretty happy with it, although it was a bit of a mess getting coal and concrete into it. That's not heavy modular frame complete though, because I didn't have enough room for regular modular frame, which ended up going in this even bigger and slightly uglier building next door. It's pretty dense inside, but I just have to show these serpentine manifold things I built in the middle, because I think they're pretty satisfying. More of those soon. All of those heavy modular frames are going towards fused modular frames, meaning I need aluminium, and rather than use that big rail bridge I just set up, I decided to build a new factory over here, and try to make it look not like shit. I also made an actually good fluid priority system here. With this vertical pipe junction, fluids coming in from the top will be reliably used over fluids coming in from the bottom. This is how it ended up looking before I put the lid on, which I thought was pretty nice, especially the hole in the middle of the upper floor there, for the 2 scrap refineries to poke through. Bauxite basically only exists in the red forest biome in the centre of the map, so I have to build a pretty big sky bridge over there to get it, although there was some coal nearby which gets me 2 out of the 3 ingredients. Quartz is way out to the east, so it gets an even longer sky bridge, but after that the only ingredient we have left is water. Rather than running a pipe all the way to the nearest body of water, which is pretty far, I use this nearby well, which requires a well pressurizer just like the nitrogen gas from earlier. With that connected up, I can put a lid on it and formally open it for business. For my next trick, I pause OBS and forget to unpause it. Yeah, we've not had much of that yet this video. In that time, I set up this new nitrogen extractor, set up my fused modular frames in this building by combining the heavy frames with aluminum casing and nitrogen, the roof of which I enclosed with concrete to hide the ugly inside. And then began on an oil setup to make all the plastic and rubber we're going to need. This oil is, again, coming from a well. It seems like now I've unlocked the ability to tap these things, they're suddenly everywhere. This one doesn't get its own building since it's so far out of the way, and because my creative battery is quickly depleting. I'm utilising the plastic to start producing computers when, suddenly, my actual batteries deplete too. That's not good. Arriving at my nuclear plant, I see that this is because my uranium waste is backed up, which is because the non-fissile uranium blender backed up on its water byproduct. I flush the output pipe and manually pull the waste out of a few reactors to get the grid back online, but fixing this is going to require some fundamental changes to this build. But instead, I just try to spread the water byproduct between the inputs to more reactors, and build a water tower for some reason, thinking that maybe the increased back pressure might force more water into the input pipes. We're probably gonna be back. With power temporarily functional again, I can finish off my computer build before starting on something new, crystal oscillators. They are made by combining reinforced iron plate, cable and quartz crystal, which itself is just processed from quartz. Combining those with computers and aluminum casing gets us radio control units, and combining those with fused modular frames gives us pressure conversion cubes, which are still not the end of this crafting chain. The final step for this chain is to combine the pressure conversion cubes with a metric fuck ton of copper powder in some particle accelerators to make nuclear pasta. So let's get to work on that metric fuck ton of copper. I'm tapping a lot of the available copper in the local area, but there's still a lot of iron, so I'm again using the copper alloy recipe to make ingots from half and half iron and copper ore. With that connected up, that's the 4th phase 4 component complete, nuclear pasta, but I still need to go back and finish this 3rd one. That continues with a pretty chunky modular engine build over here, but you've seen these before, so let's skip on to the next item. You might remember heat sinks from plutonium fuel rod production. Well, combining those with rubber, water and nitrogen gas gets us cooling systems, which this building produces. That was, unfortunately, the build that finally broke me, and with my creative juices thoroughly juiced, I built the final ingredient for the last component out in the open. That is turbo motors, which are made by combining cooling systems, radio control units, motors and rubber, and which along with modular engines, cooling systems and fused modular frames, are used to craft thermal propulsion rockets, our final ingredient of Phase 4. By now, 100 nuclear pasta had crafted, which I just hand-delivered to the space elevator since it seems pointless to set up logistics for such few items. So all we're waiting for now is the rockets. Surprise, surprise, I need to restart the nuclear reactors again, although I again do nothing to rectify it. Checking my plutonium waste containers, however, we can see that barely any has been produced in the last dozen hours since things been working. After an hour or two of exploring and artifact gathering, the 250 rockets are done, and I can bring them too to the space elevator, finally sending off Phase 4, which took me as long as the first 3 combined. We get a slightly less enthusiastic than usual summary presentation for this phase, but anyway, let's watch the propulsion system get built. It's definitely a ship, then. We can see that the components of this phase include 1,000 nuclear pasta, so it's a good job I set up so much production. Obviously we're already producing nuclear pasta, but component 2 also seems pretty easy, just requiring us to combine assembly director systems, the production for which are left intact, with water and something called fixite trigons. One of the possible paths for producing fixite requires aluminium, which is convenient because my factory for it is right there, but when I was upgrading it a bit, I was very surprised to find Nathan still alive. Perhaps I should give him more plutonium waste. Anyway, I'm bringing in Sam from a mysterious belt that stretches out into the wilderness, turning it into reanimated Sam, and then combining that with aluminium ingots in this new converter building to make fixite ingots. The trigons are then just crafted from the ingots in constructors, and feeding those into this blender with assembly director systems and water gets us biochemical sculptors. You get 4 sculptors for every 1 director system, and since the other 2 ingredients are pretty cheap, we can get this component knocked out pretty damn fast. I noticed they weren't being fed into the space elevator, and pushing my head into the input I realised it's because there's still a director system hiding in there. Quite annoyingly, I can't even pick it up, so I need to deconstruct and reconstruct the belt. Starting on component 3, I'm first converting coal into diamonds in a particle accelerator, before turning them into time crystals by passing them through a converter. The next steps require these quantum decoder buildings, and I'm starting off at the end with this one, which will eventually combine magnetic field generators, neural quantum processors, superposition oscillators, and excited photonic matter to yield AI expansion servers. I guess I'll explain each of those as we get to them. Pretty soon, I see Nathan, over here, spreading Gia and irradiating my biosculptors. I'll give you a pet, you bastard. I'm gonna be honest, I assumed because I could still pet him that he'd just get up and might have kind of attached multiple explosives to him like this, to see if I can launch him into orbit. I was getting there, I'm sure, and then... well, I don't think he's getting up. I suppose I am a bad human. Onwards, I suppose, and I set up an encoder for neural quantum processors which want time crystals, supercomputers, fixite trigons, and more excited photonic matter. Everything that consumes photonic matter produces dark matter residue, but fortunately we get rid of it as a necessary part of producing expansion servers, so it's not really an issue. The other ingredient of expansion servers, superposition oscillators, take dark matter crystals, crystal oscillators, alkali sheets, and photonic matter again. That's a lot. Let's start at the end, with combining that dark matter residue byproduct with diamonds to get us dark matter crystals. So that closes that loop. That's ingredient 1 and 2 for oscillators, provided I manage to produce some dark matter residue to start the crystals, and crystal oscillators are pretty easy to put together. I can start up the dark matter loop by converting some reanimated SAM into dark matter residue, and then excited photonic matter is just created by turning nothing and a lot of energy into it in a converter. This is a pretty cool thing to watch work, even if it's no particle accelerator. I can then belt in the supercomputers I was already making for assembly director systems, along with time crystals and trigons to make neural processors, and feeding those in with the oscillators, my magnetic field generators from phase 4, and some more photonic matter gets us AI expansion servers, component 3 of phase 5. I'm still saving up the quarter for the milestone that will let us build component 4, since it wants radio control units which are currently tied up in pumping out the last of the nuclear pasta we need. Whilst we wait, it's time for some tomfoolery. I've not spoken much about hypertubes, cause they're for the most part a slow and useless method of transportation. But by putting a load of very short hypertubes one after the other here, with the exit of each feeding straight into the entrance of the next, I can turn the 5-minute walk between the factories into a sub-minute fly. If I don't overshoot anyway. Let's try that again with a slightly shorter barrel, and even though it still overshoots I can simply ram headfirst into the space elevator cable to arrest my flight. I then build one going back too, just about skimming the cliff on the way out. And if you thought that was tomfoolery, you've seen nothing yet, cause I'm tired. And for some godforsaken reason, the devs decided to only make their game-finishing component, the ballistics warp drive, require 200 items, so I'm hand-feeding it. Because that's less effort than actually automating it somehow. To start off, singularity cells are made by combining 1 nuclear pasta, 20 dark matter crystals, and a fuck ton of iron plate and concrete, which makes 20 cells. The component itself then just needs 1 thermal rocket, 5 singularity cells, 2 super precision oscillators, and 40 dark matter crystals, which is not really that much in the grand scheme of things. That's less than an hour of ferrying materials around, provided I don't spend it doing shit like this and forget to fill the empty ingredients. Surprisingly, you can actually launch yourself all the way up to the orbital dry dock. Even if you die halfway up, your body keeps the momentum, and as long as you don't click to respawn, it will keep going. Anyway, after that grand anticlimax, it's time to send up the 5th and final phase. I pull the lever, and this time Ada doesn't have much of interest to say, so it's time to step back and watch this thing build. To launch the project, I need to do this little Space Team-esque minigame on the elevator, and then we have another prolonged cutscene to watch. Let me talk about my thoughts on this game whilst we watch. Firstly, and this is a weird one, but this is definitely the first automation game where I've felt something upon finishing it. I know I've skipped across most of the actual plot in this game, which is sparse to begin with, but judging by the biosculptors we built and shipped up in that final phase, along with the fact that we don't get to board the ship, it's all but confirmed that the Pioneer is a clone, sending a ship full of the materials to build another ship of more clones at its next destination. We essentially play as one instance of some form of biological von Neumann probe, sent out by Fixit at an unknown time in the past into the universe to save the human race. We've got no possible way to figure out how long this has been going on for, but we can do a few back-of-the-envelope calculations to see to quite what extent it's spread. Our Pioneer's allotted area on the planet is 47 square kilometres. Let's call it 50. Going off its gravity, Massage is about 15% larger than Earth, but to be charitable we'll assume it has the same land area as Earth, which is about 150 million square kilometres. That would give the planet enough room to hold 3 million Pioneers with similarly sized plots, provided the ship has enough material to clone that many Pioneers. Let's assume it doesn't, and given that we send up 1,000 biosculptors, Let's say each one can only make one pioneer, meaning each planet gets us 1,000 pioneers. We can presume they don't all succeed, but let's be further charitable and say only 10 out of 1,000 succeed, which means every ship can build 10 more ships. It took me 80 hours to finish the game, but let's pretend that's 80 days, since it's probably not meant to be 1-to-1. Let's also pretend the average pioneer takes 4 times longer than me, so 320 days. When the ship launches, it goes through a teleporter just like one we can make, which transports us instantly through space. But let's say it takes 9 years to get to the next planet, for the sake of us getting to roughly around 10 years. Although I imagine that's overly long considering the far future tech we have. After all of that, we get a 10-year cycle time from one ship arriving on one planet to 10 more ships arriving on their own next planets. If this has been going on for 30 years, that's 1,000 active ships and therefore 1,000,000 pioneers. And if it's been 100 years, that's 10 billion ships and 10 trillion pioneers. And that's with me undercutting the numbers as much as possible. It could be orders of magnitude larger than that. Think about that for a minute. Ada is a possibly sentient AI, overseeing anywhere from thousands to quintillions or more of essentially enslaved humans, which are exploited to continue the suffering and then left alone to die once their use is up. Given that it is probably clones, it might even be the same woman every time. Trillions of souls suffering across the universe for the sins of a megacorp which, as far as we know, might have gone extinct along with the rest of humanity decades before we land on Massage. On a lighter note, given that the Pioneer is a woman and Ada is arguably a woman even though she's a computer, this game came very close to being the only Factory game to pass the Bechdel test, only failing because the Pioneer doesn't have a name. Okay, I'll get on to actual feedback now. I honestly think that the phase component quotas could have been like 5 times bigger, and I would have been fine, and it would have encouraged me to automate much more extensively. I appreciate that it goes a lot against the more casual nature of this game, but would it really have hurt to put like a slider at the start where you can pick the multiplier? There is one caveat here though, because it would only be bearable if I fixed the damn blueprint system. I can't see any reason why we can't just either blueprint by selecting the same way Mass Delete works, or somehow build the blueprint around the build after it's done, maybe using some sort of like pylon items that you place at either corner. Also, we get artificial power shards near the middle of phase 5, meaning you don't have to hunt slugs to craft them anymore. But, like, why? The game's basically over by then. They'd better fit in like phase 4 when you use the bulk of your power shards. And that's enough bad because there's a lot of good in here too. The game is visually stunning, even if I didn't convey that well with my terrible building. This game is the closest I've seen a factory game get to the actual feeling of walking around in a factory, and at the same time has one of the finest environments I've ever seen crafted in any game. The building system was, for the first dozen or so hours, the most annoying thing I've ever had to deal with in a game of this genre, but once you learn and begin to master it, it quickly becomes a quick, easy and satisfying way to put together factories. For decoration specifically though, and this is very funny coming from me, I thought was pretty lacking, especially the roofs and the complete omission of half walls, despite half foundations existing. And don't even get me fucking started on rails. Sorry, good, yes. Similar to the Dyson Sphere program video, and I actually mentioned this there, I'm a sucker for the tangible progress constructing the space elevator provides. Much better than just watching a number go up. Surprisingly, I really enjoyed the exploration aspect. It gave a good rest from some of the more brain-melting factory building, and it was just a joy to look around the world. Some people will be put off by the fact that the world is the same every game, but it's so expansive that I probably only used like a quarter or a third of the resource nodes, and could easily play another few runs without ever building anywhere I did this run and finish happily. My biggest issue with this game, honestly, is that there's not more of it. Even if it would dampen the impact of the ending, I would very much enjoy if there was a sort of Phase 6 that you can just repeatedly complete, launching new ships over and over. And then I could at least make a video like, can I produce 6 ships an hour in Satisfactory, or some shit like that, and not have this be the end forever. Anyway, that's all I've got time for today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's another one which is different from my usual videos. A special thanks to my Ko-Fi supporters, whose names are on screen now.